Welcome back, historians. Brian here. Remember this guy? The monumentally vain absolute monarch with the silk stockings and the fancy wigs who managed to rule France for a record 72 years? That's right, Louis XIV is back, and today we're devoting an entire lesson to him and no one else, which is exactly how he would have wanted it. Previously, we saw how his seizure of absolute power was heavily influenced by religious conflict. In this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at the life and legacy of the man himself and ask ourselves, how exactly did he do it? Why did he distrust the nobility? How did he wield so much power? What was his relationship with the church? And what were the consequences of his costly wars? Remember, you can pause the video anytime you like to write down notes or consult your lesson guide. Alright, historians, let's get to it. Before we dive in, take a quick look at your notes. Remember the feckless nobility? Lacking in strength and character and generally irresponsible? Well, guess what? There was feckless royalty too, and that included Louis XIV's dad, who, unsurprisingly, was called Louis XIII. Louis XIII was so feckless, in fact, that he ordered his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, known as the Red Eminence. No, not that guy. That guy to run the country for him. Recall also that Richelieu took steps to consolidate royal power, and by the time Louis XIV inherited the kingdom in 1643, France was already becoming a strong, centralized state. But Louis didn't make an immediate splash. In fact, Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin, quickly seized control of the government. Was it because young Louis was feckless like his father? Nah, it was because he was only 4 years old. He was gonna need a little time to grow into the job. By the time Louis assumed the throne at age 22, he'd not only survived 3 deadly diseases, which made everyone believe he was a king blessed by God, but he'd also survived a violent rebellion led by anti-Mazarin nobles who nearly had him killed. That failed rebellion instilled in Louis a deep distrust of the nobility and fueled his desire to replace the power of the nobles with that of the bureaucracy, which he and only he would control. His first act as king was to declare that no passports would be issued to anyone unless he himself gave the okay. At first, the nobles in his court were amused, thinking this was just the naive ambition of a young king trying to throw his weight around. They assumed he'd grow tired of this kind of micromanagement. But as we'll see in a moment, they were very wrong. Now, from what I told you and from what you remember, why do you think the nobles underestimated Louis? Pause here for a moment to write down your thoughts. To Louis, every day was a grand performance, the leading role in a lifelong play, and no one before or since played that role with more pomp and flair than he did. It began at 8 in the morning. The head valet would awaken Louis in his gilded bed. The royal doctor and nurse would then enter to oversee the removal of the king's chamber pot, that's his toilet bowl, which was typically stored in an elaborately decorated piece of furniture called the commode. Next came le grand entrée, when Louis would receive a handful of nobles, some of whom paid good money just to watch the king wake up, all while the master of the bedchamber and the first servant, both high-ranking nobles, changed Louis' shirt for him. On and on the ritual would go, with courtiers of varying importance coming and going until Louis was all dressed in his curled wig, silk stockings, embroidered coat, and of course, his lace jabot, which was fastened by the master of the wardrobe and adjusted by a guy whose title was Lord of the Neckcloths. When that was done, Louis would head to the Grande Galerie, greeting certain favored members of the court along the way and receiving extravagant compliments in return. In Louis's court, being acknowledged by the king was everything. In fact, Louis apportioned his attention according to the social standing of those around him. It was essentially a pecking order that he used to manipulate the nobility into staying close to him. He might greet one noble who spent a lot of time at the palace, for example, or walk right past another who didn't. And why do you think Louis kept the nobles near? Pause here for a moment and write down your thoughts. If what you wrote down resembles something like because he wanted them far from their homes, dependent on his generosity, and eventually replaced by government bureaucrats loyal only to him, congratulations, you're on the right track. The whole performance was orchestrated to the last detail, and all of it had a purpose: to make Louis the center of everything, much like the sun itself, on whose light and warmth all life depended. In fact, this is partly why the Sun King built his magnificent palace at Versailles, one of the most ostentatious monuments to grandiosity ever conceived. Everything about Versailles was meant to show off power and wealth. It was 5 football fields long, 680,000 square feet, with over 2,000 rooms, dozens of fountains, endless acres of gardens and woods, a hall of mirrors to reflect the king's magnificence, and, to top it off, a statue of Louis himself in the courtyard. It took 36,000 laborers, 6,000 horses, and over $2.5 billion in today's money to build it, and eventually it left Louis's government in massive debt and increasingly isolated from the general population. But at its height, Versailles was arguably the most powerful center of government and arts patronage in the world, heavily supporting some of Europe's most influential composers, dramatists, and painters, and regularly staging operas and ballets, including one starring Louis himself, which was called, The Sun King. Versailles was the perfect showcase for Louis's absolute authority in France. In fact, when asked to describe the French state, Louis was rumored to have said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. And with no rival within France or beyond, he was. No rival, that is, except for the Catholic Church. And what exactly was Louis's relationship with the church? Well, not surprisingly, he believed that he should control it. At one point, he claimed the right to nominate bishops and extract revenue from church domains in France. Another time, he declared that he didn't have to answer to the Pope in Rome regarding secular matters and that he couldn't be excommunicated. Louis essentially ran the church in France, deferring to the Pope only when it served his interests and simply ignoring him when it didn't. And the French clergy, who depended on Louis, generally backed him financially and took his side whenever he disagreed with Rome. While Louis considered church authority to be inferior to his own within France, he did regard the church as an essential tool for maintaining absolute power. He also didn't tolerate any other churches except for what he considered the one true Catholic Church. Why do you think Louis didn't tolerate any other churches? Pause here for a moment and write down your thoughts. If you wrote down something like because tolerating more than one church represented a threat to state unity, congratulations, you're absolutely right. That's one reason why he revoked the Edict of Nantes and deprived French Protestants of their religious and civil liberties. It's also why he attempted to intimidate French Protestant families into converting to Catholicism, and why he cracked down on Jansenism, a movement within the Catholic Church that was declared heretical. France under Louis XIV was the most powerful country in Europe. Its army was larger, more advanced, and better trained than any other. That was no accident. Louis spent decades trying to gain territory for France. His wars of expansion pitted him at various times against England, Holland, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Savoy, and many others. All these wars took a toll on the French people and on the government's treasury, and by the time Louis died in 1715, the reaction of the French public was to celebrate. They were sick of war, sick of taxes to pay for war, and ultimately, sick of 72 years of Louis. He'd built France into a major military power. He'd ushered in a golden age of French arts and culture, and he'd overseen an empire of colonies that provided vast resources and trade. But the constant warfare and the construction of Versailles burdened the government with crushing debt, which caused major headaches for his heirs and eventually led to bloody revolution. And the best part is there's so much more to the story. As we move forward, keep your eyes open and keep looking around you because history is everywhere.